There is a clay tablet sitting in a museum archive that most Egyptologists and classical historians do not talk about in public. It is not because the tablet is damaged, or because it is too small to read, or because the language on it has never been deciphered. The tablet is intact. The language is Sumerian, and Sumerian has been translated for over a century. The scholars who have seen it know exactly what it says. The reason they do not talk about it is because of what it shows. Because what is pressed into that ancient clay in cuneiform script that is more than 4,000 years old is a map. Not a map of a city, not a map of a trade route or a river or a mountain range. It is a map of something else entirely. A map of what lies beneath. A map of a place the Sumerians called the Kur. The place the dead go. The place that exists below the foundations of the earth, below the fresh water table they called the Abzu, below the 7 layers of stone and soil and darkness that separate the living world from the world that waits for everyone when they stop living. And on that map, marked with deliberate precision, is a location, a physical location, a place on the surface of the earth where, according to the people who drew the map, the boundary between this world and the one below it becomes thin enough to pass through, where the gate stands, where you can enter. The Sumerians did not describe this as mythology. They did not frame it as metaphor or poetry or religious allegory. They described it the way a cartographer describes a coastline, with measurements, with landmarks, with directions, with the specific names of the beings who guard the threshold and the specific conditions under which the passage opens. And when you lay the coordinates they describe against the actual geography of the ancient Near East, something deeply uncomfortable happens. The location they describe exists. It is a real place. It has a name that predates the Sumerian civilization itself. And people have been finding strange things there for a very, very long time. If you are new here, welcome. If you have been here before, you already know what this channel does. We go where the mainstream conversation stops. We read the tablets they do not put in the textbooks. We ask the questions that make archaeologists change the subject. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you do not miss what comes next. This one goes deep. Deeper than you might be comfortable with by the end. That is exactly the point. The word Kur in ancient Sumerian does not have a clean translation into English. Modern scholars render it as Underworld, and that is close enough for an entry in a dictionary, but it loses almost everything that made the concept real to the people who invented it. Kur does not mean the underworld the way a Christian might think of hell, as a place of punishment for moral failure. It does not mean it the way a Greek might think of Hades, as a dim and colorless waiting room where shades drift without purpose or memory. In Sumerian cosmology, the Kur was a functioning place. It had geography, it had rulers, it had a bureaucracy, it had a legal system with records and judgments. It had an economy of sorts, a system by which the dead were sustained, judged, categorized, and assigned their station in the afterlife. It had districts and regions and specific zones that corresponded to different categories of the dead. Warriors who died in battle went to one part of it. People who died without children went to another. People who had no one left alive to pour offerings for them lived in a particularly bleak section near the outer edge. The Kur was not imagined, it was administered. And the Sumerians wrote about it not the way people write about a dream or a vision, but the way people write about a place they have received detailed reports about. The way a scribe records what an ambassador has told them about a foreign city. Clinical, specific. Cross-referenced. The civilization we call Sumerian arose in the region of southern Mesopotamia, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what is today the southern half of Iraq. They did not call themselves Sumerians. That is a name assigned to them by later peoples and adopted by modern archaeology. They called their land Sumer, and their language the black-headed people's tongue. They appeared with remarkable suddenness around 4500 BCE, with a level of organizational sophistication that has puzzled researchers since the field of archaeology began. They had writing before anyone else in the recorded world. They had mathematics. They had astronomy so precise that some of their celestial calculations were not corrected by European science until the 17th century CE. They had legal codes, water management infrastructure, architectural traditions, and medical practices. They had all of this within what appears, archaeologically, to be an extremely compressed window of cultural development. Other civilizations took thousands of years to develop writing. The Sumerians seemed to begin with it nearly fully formed. They had a word for the concept of a library before most cultures had a concept for a city. And they were obsessed, with an intensity that modern scholars find difficult to fully contextualize, with the dead, with where the dead went, with the geography of that destination, with the rules that govern the passage from this world into the next one, with the gate. The text that contains the map is part of a larger body of literature that scholars call the descent texts. There are several of them. The most famous in mainstream Sumeriology is the text known as The Descent of Inanna, which describes the journey of the goddess Inanna, the Sumerian queen of heaven, into the Kur. She goes down, she passes through 7 gates. At each gate, she is stripped of something she is wearing or carrying, an item of clothing, a piece of jewelry, a symbol of power, until by the time she reaches the center of the underworld, she has nothing left. She stands before the queen of the dead, a being called Ereshkigal, who is her own sister, and she is killed. Then she comes back. That text is taught in university courses on ancient literature, and is considered one of the oldest narrative poems in human history. What is not taught in those same courses, what rarely appears in the syllabi of comparative religion departments or the display cases of the world's major museums, is the companion text. The text that was written as a kind of administrative supplement to the descent narrative. The text that does not describe the journey in mythological terms, but instead provides what appears to be actual geographic instruction. What the map text says is this: the entrance to the Kur is not everywhere. It is not beneath every patch of ground. It is in a specific place, a place that was identified, surveyed, marked, and recorded. A place with physical characteristics that distinguish it from the surrounding landscape, and a place that, according to the text, can be found by anyone who knows what to look for. Before we go further into what the map text describes, we need to understand the cosmological framework the Sumerians used, because without it, the map does not make sense. In Sumerian belief, the universe was structured in layers. The uppermost layer was the realm of the high gods, the Anunnaki, who resided in the heavens, in the region of light and order above the sky dome. Below the sky dome was the layer of visible heaven, the place of stars and planets, and the movements that the Sumerian astronomers tracked with obsessive precision over thousands of years. Below that was the surface of the earth, the middle world, the place of human beings and mortal life. Below the earth was a layer of fresh water, a vast underground sea that the Sumerians called the Abzu, and which they believed was the source of all rivers and springs and wells. Below the Abzu was the first level of the Kur, the outermost boundary of the underworld, the place where the recently dead first arrived and began their transition. And below that, descending through 6 more levels, was the Deep Kur, the place of final residence, ruled by Ereshkigal and administered by her consort, a god named Nergal, and a vast staff of divine bureaucrats called the Anunnaki of the Underworld, who were distinct from, but related to, the Anunnaki of the upper world. The Sumerians believed that these 2 sets of divine beings, the ones above and the ones below, existed in a kind of permanent negotiated tension. They had different jurisdictions, they had different powers, and they communicated through intermediaries who moved between the levels. One of those intermediaries was the gatekeeper of the descent passage. The gatekeeper had a name. It is one of the most important details in the map text, because names in Sumerian cosmology were not arbitrary labels. A name in Sumerian thinking was a statement of function, a description of an essential nature. The gatekeeper of the first gate was called Neti, and Neti's name, when parsed through the grammatical structures of the Sumerian language, means something like the one who holds the mechanism of the threshold, or more literally, the holder of the bolt. Not a metaphorical bolt, not a symbolic lock, a physical mechanism, a device that could be in the open or closed position, a door that operated according to rules that Neti enforced. The map text describes Neti as receiving instructions from Ereshkigal about who may pass and under what conditions. These instructions change. They are not permanent. There are times when the gate is more open and times when it is less open, and these times correspond in the text to astronomical positions, specifically the positions of certain bodies in the sky that the Sumerians called the Watchers. The Watchers are described elsewhere in Sumerian literature as a class of beings who maintain the order of the cosmos and whose movements mark the turning of significant periods of time. When certain Watchers reach certain positions, the mechanisms of the underworld respond. The gate loosens. The boundary thins. This is not described as a spiritual or metaphorical event. It is described as a physical consequence of cosmic mechanics. The question of what the Watchers actually were has been a point of quiet controversy in Sumeriology for decades. The mainstream interpretation is that they are planets, specifically the 5 planets visible to the naked eye: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. These 5, plus the Sun and the Moon, constitute the 7 celestial objects that moved against the fixed stars in the Sumerian astronomical system, and they were tracked, named, and attributed with qualities and jurisdictions that influenced everything from agricultural timing to political decisions to medical diagnoses. The mainstream view is that when the Sumerian texts say the Watchers take certain positions that affect the gate of the underworld, this is poetic language for the influence of planetary alignments on the spiritual atmosphere. That is a perfectly reasonable interpretation. It is also the interpretation that requires the least uncomfortable conclusion. There is another interpretation, one that has been circulating in the outer zones of ancient history research since the 1970s. When a scholar named Zechariah Sitchin began publishing a body of work that translated certain Sumerian terms in a radically different way. Sitchin's interpretation, stripped of the more speculative extensions that his critics focused on, begins with a simple observation. The Sumerian word for the divine beings who descend from above and whose activities are described in the creation texts does not mean what the standard academic translation says it means. The word is Anunnaki. And according to Sitchin, it does not mean those of princely blood or those of royal seed, which is the conventional translation. It means, literally, those who from heaven to earth came. This is not a wild departure from the linguistic roots of the word. It is arguably a more faithful rendering of the component morphemes. And if you accept that translation even provisionally, then the entire character of Sumerian cosmology shifts. The beings who created the world, who established the underworld, who built the gate and appointed its keeper and determined its operating schedule, are not supernatural deities in the religious sense. They are travelers, they came from somewhere else, and they built at a specific location on the surface of the earth a mechanism that connected the surface to what is below it. What is below the specific location the map text describes? That is a question that has been investigated, quietly and intermittently, since the region was first surveyed by Western archaeologists in the mid-19th century. The site is located in what is today southeastern Iraq, in the province of Kar, in a landscape that is now mostly flat desert with a network of irrigation channels and the ruins of ancient settlements scattered across it at irregular intervals. The landscape does not look dramatic. It does not look like an entrance to another world. It looks like what it is, a hot, mostly flat, semi-arid plain with the occasional mound of ancient rubble where a city once stood. But beneath that flat surface, surveys conducted by geophysical teams in the 1990s and early 2000s have detected something that has not been fully explained in the published literature. There is a network of underground cavities in the region. Not small cavities. The cavity systems detected in survey data taken southeast of the ruins of the ancient city of Eridu, which is widely regarded as the oldest city in the world, extend to the depths that have not been fully mapped. Eridu in Sumerian tradition was the first city. The city that was built before the flood. The city that was built by the god Enki, who is the lord of the Absu, the lord of the underground fresh water, the being in Sumerian cosmology, who maintains the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. And at Eridu, in the lowest and most ancient layer of the site, archaeologists have found the foundations of a structure that is older than the pyramids of Egypt, older than the stone circles of the British Isles, older than any comparable monument in the world. They call it the Enki Temple. They date it to approximately 5300 BCE, and they have noted in the published reports that do not get cited in popular science journalism that the deepest foundations of this structure descend into the earth to a depth that the excavations of the 1940s and 1950s could not reach the bottom of. They stopped digging at a certain point. The report describes the lower layers as unstable. It does not elaborate. The map text, when it describes the location of the gate, uses a set of landmarks that are internally consistent, and when matched against the known geography of ancient southern Mesopotamia, point to a location within the general area of Eridu. The landmarks include a specific type of geological feature, a place where the ground makes a sound when struck, a description consistent with the hollow resonance that can be produced by a large subsurface cavity near the surface. The text describes a body of standing water nearby, which corresponds to the ancient lake that archaeologists believe surrounded or bordered the original site of Eridu before the hydrological patterns of the region shifted over millennia. It describes a specific species of date palm that grows only at this location and is described as being of unusual height. And it describes a smell, a specific smell. The Sumerian text uses a phrase that translates most naturally as the breath of the lower waters, an odor associated in multiple Sumerian texts with the presence of the Abzu, the underground fresh water layer, when it is close to the surface. People who have worked in areas of southern Iraq where the water table is near the surface have described exactly this smell, a combination of mineral sulfur and organic decomposition that is recognizable and specific and unlike the smell of surface water. The map is not describing a dream location. It is describing a real place with real sensory characteristics that can be verified against known physical phenomena. Here is where things become significantly more complicated. In the year 1849, a British diplomat and amateur archaeologist named Austin Henry Layard published an account of his excavations at sites in northern Mesopotamia, in the region of the ancient Assyrian capital of Nineveh, near the modern city of Mosul. Layard's work gave the world the first large-scale systematic recovery of Assyrian artifacts, including the famous lion hunt reliefs and the enormous winged bull figures called lamassu that now stand in the British Museum. What is less often discussed in the popular accounts of Layard's work is what he found in a specific chamber at the site of Kuyunjik, the inner mound of ancient Nineveh, where the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal was located. Among the thousands of cuneiform tablets in the library, which Layard sent to London and which were subsequently organized and catalogued by scholars at the British Museum, there was a group of tablets that were kept separate from the main collection. Layard noted in his field journal that these tablets were found in a sealed room, not a room that had simply collapsed or filled with debris over the centuries, but a room whose door had been deliberately blocked with large stones cemented in place with bitumen, the same waterproof tar-like substance that was used in ancient Mesopotamia to seal boat hulls and waterproof containers intended for long-term preservation. Someone had sealed this room. Someone had intended what was inside to remain sealed. And inside, along with the other tablets that were brought to London, was a set of tablets that Layard described in his journal as different in character from the others, more careful, more deliberately made, on a different quality of clay. He did not read cuneiform and could not know what they said. They went to London with everything else, and in London they were catalogued, studied by a series of translators over the following decades, and eventually assigned museum numbers. They are still in the British Museum. The translations of them that have been published are partial. The scholars who have worked on them most recently have described the untranslated portions as requiring additional specialist review. What has been published from those tablets includes the following. There is a text that describes a journey to a place called the mouth of the rivers, a location identified in the text as the point where the underground rivers emerge from beneath the earth and become surface rivers. This location is identified in the text with extraordinary specificity, using references to the positions of specific stars at the time of year, when the underground rivers are closest to the surface, which the text says occurs when the Pleiades are directly overhead at midnight, an astronomical configuration that in the ancient Near East occurred in late autumn, around what we now call November. The text says that at this time, at the mouth of the rivers, the stone that covers the descent passage can be moved. Not permanently. For a period of time, it does not specify how long. It describes the stone as marked with the seal of Nergal, the lord of the underworld, and it describes what happens to a person who moves the stone and descends without the proper preparation. The description is detailed, it is not pleasant, it involves a dissolution of the person's identity in a way that sounds less like death and more like the person is still there but has become something different. Something that cannot return through the same passage it descended through. The text is using Sumerian medical and spiritual terminology that has specific meanings in context, and those meanings, when translated, describe a process that modern neurological language might call a catastrophic dissociation of self. The person goes down, the person does not come back, something comes back, but it is not the person. This is the detail that the ancient astronaut theorists find most significant. Not the existence of the gate, not the map itself, but the description of what the gate does to consciousness. Because in the literature of multiple ancient civilizations that had no direct contact with Sumerian culture, the same description appears. The Egyptian Book of the Dead describes certain passages through the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, as capable of transforming the traveler in exactly this way, a transformation that is described as desirable if properly prepared for and catastrophic if not. The Tibetan Bardo Thodol, the text the West calls the Tibetan Book of the Dead, describes the transitional state between death and rebirth as a series of passages through which the consciousness of the deceased moves and warns in explicit terms that encountering certain aspects of this transition without preparation results in a kind of identity dissolution, a scattering of the self across multiple levels of reality simultaneously. The Book of Enoch, an ancient Jewish text that was removed from the canonical Bible but preserved in the Ethiopian Church and in Dead Sea Scroll fragments, describes the descent of the Watchers, a group of divine beings who come down to earth at specific times and through specific locations, and describes those locations as places where the boundary between levels of reality is mechanically thinner than elsewhere. The Greek tradition of the Eleusinian mysteries, the secret initiatory rites that were practiced at the site of Eleusis near Athens for approximately 2,000 years, and which were attended by nearly every major figure of classical Greek civilization, including Plato and Aristotle, centered on a ritual descent into an underground chamber and emergence that initiates described in the fragments of their accounts that have survived despite the oath of secrecy as an experience of dying and returning. The site of Eleusis has been excavated. The underground chamber is there, it is carved into bedrock, it descends. No one has satisfactorily explained what happened in it that produced the results reported by the initiates, results including a permanent reduction in the fear of death, a sense of direct encounter with another order of reality, and descriptions of beings encountered in the underground space that are consistent across centuries of practitioner accounts. The Eleusinian mysteries ended in 392 CE when the Christian Roman Emperor Theodosius Stagionen Martundus banned all non-Christian religious practices. By that point, they had been practiced continuously for approximately 2,000 years. The last initiates took their oath of silence to their graves, and the secret of what happened in the underground chamber at Eleusis has never been recovered. but the accounts of what it felt like are almost word for word identical to the Sumerian map text's description of the descent passage. The same landmarks, the same transformation, the same warning about the consequence of unprepared passage. The scholar who first noticed this pattern in a systematic and publishable way was not a fringe researcher. He was not a retired military officer writing self-published books about alien civilizations. He was a professor of Near Eastern languages and cultures at a major American research university, and his name appears in the footnotes of graduate-level textbooks in his field. He published a paper in an academic journal in 1987 that compared the phenomenology of the Sumerian descent texts with parallel texts from Egypt, the Levant, Greece, and the Indus Valley civilization. The paper was not controversial in its methodology. Its methodology was sound. It was controversial in its conclusion. The conclusion was that the similarities between these texts were too specific and too structurally consistent to be explained by the standard model of cultural diffusion, the model that says ideas spread from one culture to another through trade, migration, and imitation. The structural specifics of the descent texts, the seven-level architecture of the underworld, the gatekeeper with a mechanism of passage, the stripping of the traveler's surface identity as they descend through the levels, the encounter with a sovereign being at the deepest level, and the specific conditions under which the passage is possible, are too precisely mirrored across cultures that had no documented contact with one another to be coincidental. His paper suggested, carefully and with full academic hedging, that either all of these traditions derive from a single common source that predated all of them, or they were independently describing the same real phenomenon, a real feature of the physical or metaphysical universe that multiple cultures discovered independently because it is actually there. He did not say which option he believed. He said the data required the question to be asked seriously. The paper was published. It received responses. Most of the responses critiqued the paper on the grounds that the similarities were not as specific as the author claimed, that the standard model of cultural diffusion was adequate to explain the overlap, and that the two options he proposed were not the only ones available. He responded to those responses. The exchange was published, and then the conversation stopped. His university is still a major research university. His department still exists. His papers are still cited in footnotes. He has not published on this specific question since 1993. Let us go back to the tablets, to the specific content of the map text, because we have been circling it, and it is time to go inside it. The text is composed in a form that Sumerian literature scholars call the Eridu Genesis family. This is a cluster of tablets from the city of Nippur, which was the religious and scribal capital of ancient Sumer. Tablets that deal with the earliest period of Sumerian history, the period before and immediately after the Great Flood that Sumerian tradition, like many ancient traditions worldwide, records as a civilization-ending catastrophe. The tablets in the Eridu Genesis family describe the creation of human beings by the Anunnaki, the establishment of the first cities, the kings who ruled before the flood, and whose reigns are given in the king lists as extending for tens of thousands of years each, the flood itself, and the period of reconstruction immediately after it. Nested within this material, referenced in multiple tablets, but never given a full dedicated text in the recovered record, is the description of what was built at Eridu before the flood. What was built there was not only a temple. What was built there was a structure that the text calls the House of the Abzu, a name that, in the context of the surrounding material, means more than just a building dedicated to the water god. It means a structure that physically interfaces with the Abzu, the underground layer of water, and beneath that, the upper boundary of the Kur. The House of the Abzu at Eridu was built over and around and descending into a specific point on the Earth's surface where the layers of the cosmic structure are accessible, where you can go down. The map text is a description of how to find that point and what you will encounter when you go toward it. The 7 gates of the descent are described in the map text in a way that differs significantly from how they are described in the mythological descent of Inanna. In the Inanna text, the 7 gates are presented as geographic thresholds within the underworld itself, places you pass through as you descend from the surface into the deep Kur. Each gate is associated with a quality or a possession that is removed from the traveler, and the cumulative effect of the 7 removals is the dissolution of the traveler's worldly identity. In the map text, the gates are described differently. They are described as existing in a physical structure, a built structure, something that was constructed. The map text uses the Sumerian word for building or house for the structure within which the 7 gates exist, and it uses a word for the material of the walls that translates most naturally as a very hard stone, possibly granite or a granite-like material, which is significant because granite does not occur naturally in southern Mesopotamia. The alluvial plain of southern Iraq has almost no stone at all. Everything that was built there in the ancient world required materials to be transported from other regions, specifically from the mountains to the north and east. The use of granite-like material at a site in the deep south of Mesopotamia, at a location as remote and flat as the area around Eridu, would represent a massive logistical operation. An operation that required either a very large and organized labor force or a technology for moving extremely heavy stone objects over long distances, or both. The map text does not describe how the material was brought to the site. It describes the material as being there, as being part of a structure that existed when the text was composed, which means the structure itself, or at least the tradition of its existence, predates the text by an indeterminate period. Archaeologists excavated the site of Eridu beginning in 1946 and continuing through 1949, under the direction of a team from the Iraq Directorate of Antiquities, led by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd. What they found at Eridu remains one of the most important and least discussed discoveries in the history of Near Eastern archaeology. At the bottom of an excavation trench sunk beneath the main temple mound, they found evidence of 18 successive building phases, 18 separate construction layers laid one on top of the other over thousands of years, each one built directly on the foundations of the previous one. The earliest of these layers, designated Temple Level 1, was dated to approximately 5300 BCE. That makes it the oldest building in the world by a significant margin. The dating is secure, it is not controversial. What is less often discussed is the nature of Temple Level Y. It is a small building, about 3 meters by 3 meters, made of mud brick in the style of the period. But beneath it, below the mud brick floor, at a depth that the excavators described in their field notes as surprisingly deep, given the relatively small size of the structure above, they found something they did not describe in the formal published report. The field notes, which are held at the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, and which were partially summarized in a 1984 academic paper on early Mesopotamian sacred architecture, mention an underground chamber, a cut stone chamber, not mud brick, that extended below the floor of Temple Level 1 to a depth that the excavators could not safely explore without additional equipment they did not have on site. The chamber was backfilled during the excavation for safety reasons. The field notes describe the stone as darker and harder than the local limestone and sandstone that is found in the region, possibly brought from elsewhere. The 1984 paper that references this describes the chamber as a natural cave modified by human construction and moves on. The field notes do not use the word natural, they use the word cut. A cut stone chamber beneath the oldest building in the world, at the site that Sumerian tradition identifies as the location of the House of the Abzu, the structure built by the Lord of the Underworld over the point where the surface of the earth interfaces with the layers below it. Backfilled in 1949, not re-excavated. The Iraq Museum, where the field notes are held, was looted during the 2003 invasion. A significant portion of its records were lost or damaged. The 1984 paper is the most detailed surviving reference to the field notes about the underground chamber, and the 1984 paper treats it as a minor footnote about a natural cave. There is a pattern in the history of ancient sites that ancient astronaut researchers call selective archaeology, and that mainstream archaeologists call the normal constraints of excavation priority. The pattern is this. When an excavation at a major ancient site produces findings that fit comfortably within the existing historical model, those findings are published fully, displayed in museums, written about in popular books, and cited repeatedly in subsequent academic literature. When an excavation produces findings that do not fit comfortably within the existing model, those findings are published partially, stored in archives, referenced in footnotes, and rarely cited again. The chamber at Eridu is one example. There are others, and we will come to them. The point is not that there is a conspiracy to hide evidence. The point is that the existing model creates a gravity well of interpretation. Findings that fall within it are automatically understood and easily written about. Findings that fall outside it require a new framework to describe, and creating a new framework is difficult, career risky, and time-consuming. Most scholars do not do it. They note the anomaly, they move on, and the anomaly remains. Sitting in a field note or a footnote or an archive, waiting for someone who is willing to take the time to build the new framework. The ancient astronaut framework is one attempt to build that new framework. It is not the only one, and it is not without significant problems. Zechariah. Sitchin's specific claims about the Anunnaki, particularly his interpretation of the planet Nibiru as a 12th planet in our solar system, with an extremely elongated orbit that brings it into the inner solar system every 3,600 years, have been examined by astronomers and found to be incompatible with the observed behavior of the solar system. If a body of the mass Sitchin attributed to Nibiru were to pass through the inner solar system on the schedule he described, the gravitational effects on the other planets would be measurable and would have been measured. They have not been. This is a real problem with the Nibiru hypothesis specifically, but the Nibiru hypothesis is not the same thing as the broader Anunnaki interpretation. It is possible that Sitchin's linguistic translation of Anunnaki, as those who from heaven to earth came, is correct, and that his Nibiru theory is wrong without any logical contradiction. Languages do not always encode cosmological physics accurately. People who came from somewhere else might describe that somewhere else in mythological terms that do not correspond to a literal planet. The Sumerian word for what the Anunnaki came from does not have to mean a physical planet in our solar system. It could mean a realm that is not described by the physics of the solar system. It could mean a level of reality that is adjacent to this one but not accessible through the conventional dimensions of space. In other words, it could mean exactly what the map text says. It means when it describes the origin point of Ereshkigal, the queen of the Underworld, whose original home before she was assigned to the Kur is described in one text as a place above and separate, a place whose nature is not given a further description, because the text assumes the reader already knows what it is. Which means the original Sumerian audience for these texts knew what the place was. They had a shared cultural context within which the description made sense without elaboration. That context has been lost. And recovering it, or attempting to recover it, is what drives both the academic study of Sumerian literature and the forbidden history research community. From very different directions toward the same set of questions, let us talk about Nergal. Because Nergal is the key to the gate text, and Nergal is one of the least discussed of the major Sumerian deities in the popular literature, which is itself a significant fact. Nergal was the lord of the Underworld, the consort and co-ruler of Ereshkigal, and the god of death, pestilence, and the destructive aspect of sunlight. He ruled the Kur, he administered the judgment of the dead, he was worshipped at a cult center in the ancient city of Cutha, which is located in central Iraq, about 80 kilometers south of the ruins of Babylon. The ruins of Cutha have been partially excavated and are now known as Tel Ibrahim. They are not a major tourist destination. They are not discussed much in popular archaeology. The site contains the remains of a temple dedicated to Nergal, and beneath that temple, according to written sources from the period, was an underground structure specifically associated with the cult of the dead, a place where rituals of descent and return were conducted, where the priests of Nergal believed they could communicate with the lord of the underworld, and through him with the dead and with the deeper levels of the Kur. The site of Cutha is mentioned in the Old Testament. It is mentioned in the second book of Kings, in the context of the Assyrian resettlement of the northern kingdom of Israel in the 8th century BCE, as one of the cities from which foreign populations were brought to resettle the depopulated regions. The people of Cutha, according to the biblical text, brought their god with them. They made Nergal their god. The biblical author treats this as idolatry, a straightforward foreign god worshipped to be condemned and moved past. But the people of Cutha were not simply worshiping an idea, they were worshiping a being that had a specific location, a specific address in the cosmos, a specific physical site on Earth where contact with that being was held to be possible. And they took that knowledge with them when they moved. The textual tradition around Nergal includes one extraordinarily specific text that has received surprisingly little attention given its content. It is known in academic catalogs as the descent of Ishtar to the Underworld, where Ishtar is the Akkadian name for the Sumerian goddess Inanna. But there is a companion piece to that text, not always discussed in the same papers, that is sometimes called the Nergal and Ereshkigal text, which describes the events from the other side of the descent, from the perspective of the Underworld's rulers. In this text, Nergal is initially a heavenly being, one of the upper Anunnaki, who offends the messenger of Ereshkigal and is sent down to the Kur. As a consequence, he descends through the 7 gates. He meets Ereshkigal. He seizes her by the hair. He throws her to the ground. She proposes marriage. He accepts. He becomes the lord of the underworld. The text then describes, in a section that is usually treated as narrative flavor, the specific responsibilities that Nergal takes on as lord of the Kur. These include the maintenance of a specific mechanism that is described with technical vocabulary. The Akkadian and Sumerian words used in this section have been variously translated as the lock of the underworld, the bolt of fate, and the keeper of the measurements. The last of these is the most interesting. The keeper of the measurements. A mechanism that requires regular measurement, a device that has settings that can be adjusted. Something that Nergal, as Lord of the Underworld, is responsible for calibrating. This is not the language of mythology in the loose sense. This is the language of engineering. What kind of mechanism requires calibration and exists at the boundary between the surface world and the underworld? If you are working within the standard mythological framework, the answer is that this is a metaphor for the balance of cosmic forces, and the calibration is a poetic description of divine administrative management. That is a satisfying answer if you are comfortable with the standard framework. If you are not, the answer takes a different shape. There is a class of physical phenomena that operates at the boundary between the surface of the Earth and the rock layers beneath it, and that requires understanding of measurable quantities to characterize. These phenomena include geomagnetic anomalies, piezoelectric effects in stressed rock formations, electromagnetic emissions from active fault systems, infrasound generation from deep geological processes, and the behavior of underground water under pressure. Each of these phenomena is measurable. Each of them varies with time, with geological activity, with the movement of heavenly bodies that exert gravitational influence on the Earth's crust. The gravitational pull of the moon on the Earth's lithosphere is well documented and creates what geologists call earth tides, slow deformations of the solid crust that respond to the moon's position exactly as ocean tides respond to it, just more slowly and less visibly. The gravitational influence of Jupiter, the largest planet in the solar system, is also measurable in its effects on Earth's orbit and on the geological activity associated with the motion of tectonic plates. These influences are cyclical. They can be predicted. They can be mapped against astronomical positions. If a mechanism at a specific location on the Earth's surface were sensitive to these kinds of influences, then the operating schedule of that mechanism, the times when it is most active, when its effects on the environment around it are strongest, could be described in terms of astronomical positions, in terms of where the watchers are. This is not wild speculation. This is a description of known physical reality, applied to the question of what the Sumerian map text might have been trying to document in the language available to a 4,000-year-old scribal culture. The Sumerians did not have the vocabulary of modern geophysics. They had the vocabulary of their cosmological system. If they were documenting a real phenomenon, a real location where geophysical conditions produce effects that are anomalous and regular and predictable and tied to astronomical cycles, they would describe it using their cosmological vocabulary. The gate of the underworld that opens when the watchers reach certain positions is a description of a geophysically anomalous location whose anomalous effects intensify at periods corresponding to specific astronomical configurations. That is a falsifiable hypothesis. It is not the kind of hypothesis that gets funded for testing. It is not the kind of hypothesis that a career-minded geophysicist would publish in a journal paper as their primary claim. But it is not, strictly speaking, unscientific. It is speculative in the way that all pre-data hypotheses are speculative, and it has a specific prediction built into it. The specific prediction is that the location described in the map text, if it corresponds to a real physical location, should display measurable geophysical anomalies that vary with time according to a pattern that correlates with astronomical cycles. And the area around Eridu in southern Iraq, which is the location most consistent with the map text description when the landmarks are matched against known geography, has not been subjected to a systematic geophysical survey with the specific goal of testing this hypothesis. The region is a war zone. It has been a war zone intermittently for the past several decades. The conditions for doing careful science there do not currently exist, and so the hypothesis remains untested. The anomaly in the field notes remains backfilled, and the map text remains in the archive, translated partially, cited rarely, and waiting. There is something the map text says about the experience of approaching the gate that deserves careful attention because it has an analog in the modern world. The text describes a traveler approaching the location of the gate and experiencing a specific sequence of perceptual changes before reaching the physical threshold. The sequence, as translated by the scholars who have worked on the legible portions of the relevant tablet, is as follows. First, the traveler hears something. The text uses a word that translates approximately as the sound beneath the sound, a description of something audible that exists at the lower edge of normal hearing. Something felt more in the chest and the bones than in the ears. This description is consistent with what modern acoustics calls infrasound. Sound waves at frequencies below approximately 20 Hz, the lower limit of human hearing. Infrasound is not heard with the ears in the conventional sense. It is felt. It produces a characteristic set of physiological effects, including a feeling of unease, a sense of presence, a perception that something is in the room or the space that is not visually present. Infrasound is produced by a variety of geological sources, including active fault systems, underground water movement, and the resonance of underground cavities. The tunnel systems and cave systems beneath certain ancient sites have been measured and found to produce infrasound at frequencies that correspond to the frequencies most associated with the physiological effects described above. The sites at which this has been measured include Newgrange in Ireland, the Hypogeum of Hal Saflieni in Malta, and the inner chambers of the Great Pyramid of Giza. In each case, the infrasound production appears to be a consequence of the site's geometry and geology, not a deliberate design choice, or at least that is the conventional interpretation. The alternative interpretation is that the people who built these structures understood the acoustic properties of underground spaces and deliberately designed the geometry to produce specific frequencies, and that the specific frequencies they targeted were the ones that produced the physiological effects described in the map text account of approaching the gate, the feeling of something else being present, the awareness of another level of reality pressing through the physical surface of this one. Second, the text says, the traveler's vision changes. The text uses a phrase that translates as, the eye see the two ways simultaneously, a description of a visual experience in which the traveler perceives both the physical landscape in front of them and something else overlaid on it or behind it, another scene, another space, visible but not solid, present but not fully manifest. This description appears in accounts of experiences associated with a number of different physical triggers, including electromagnetic anomalies, specific combinations of infrasound and oxygen-depleted atmospheres common in deep caves, and the effects of certain alkaloid compounds that occur naturally in plants common to the ancient Near East, and that were used in documented temple ritual contexts. The Sumerian tradition associated the approach to the underworld with a specific plant that the texts call the plant of heartbeat, whose identity is debated, but whose description matches several candidates with hallucinogenic or dissociative properties. The ritual preparation described in the map text for a traveler intending the descent includes consuming something, a specific prepared substance, that the text describes as opening the vision to the two ways. This is not metaphorical. The text is describing a specific substance with a specific effect that is part of the protocol for approaching the gate. And that substance, whatever it was, presumably produced the visual phenomenology that the text is describing. The question is whether that phenomenology is purely pharmacological, a hallucination produced by a chemical effect on the brain's visual processing, or whether the pharmacological effect is functioning as a tool that allows the brain to perceive something that is actually there, but not normally perceptible. That question remains open in the philosophy of consciousness and in the academic study of entheogenic substances, and it was not resolved by the Sumerians, who appear to have worked with the pragmatic assumption that the substance worked as described without needing to resolve the metaphysical question of why it worked. Third, and this is the part that the map text emphasizes most strongly, the traveler feels cold. Not ambient cold, not the cold of a cave or an underground space, which is a consistent and even temperature distinct from, but not dramatically below surface temperature. The text uses a word for a cold that is described as coming from below, that is described as moving upward through the ground into the body of the traveler, that is described as being associated with a smell. The smell it is associated with is the same smell described earlier in the text as one of the landmarks of the gate location, the breath of the lower waters, cold rising from below, combined with the smell of deep underground water. This is a description of a real physical phenomenon, cold air and cold water rising from underground cave systems, when the atmospheric pressure differential between the surface and the underground space creates a flow. This happens at certain cave entrances and underground openings. The air that flows out of deep underground spaces is at a stable cool temperature and carries the smell of the underground environment, which in water-bearing geological formations includes the mineral smell of the water and the organic smell of the cave ecosystem. Someone approaching the location of the gate, if the gate is indeed a physical location, with access to an underground cave or tunnel system, would experience exactly this: rising cold air, a specific smell, and potentially, if the underground space is of the right geometry, infrasound, and the associated perceptual effects. The map text is describing a physical location with physical characteristics that correspond to a real type of geological feature. It is not describing a fantasy. It is describing a place. Now let us bring the Anunnaki back into the picture, because they are inseparable from the gate. The Anunnaki of the upper world, the divine beings who in Sumerian cosmology created human beings and established civilization on the surface of the earth, are described in the creation texts as needing something from the earth. The texts use a word that has been translated as gold, and in the standard mythological interpretation, this is simply a divine preference for precious metal. The gods like shiny things, which is satisfying as far as it goes. But the word the texts use for what the Anunnaki needed from the earth is not the standard Sumerian word for gold as a decorative material. It is a word that appears in context associated with function and utility, not with ornamentation. The same word appears in texts describing the preparation of substances used in ritual and medical contexts. It appears in texts describing the components of specific technological devices whose exact nature cannot be reconstructed from the textual record because the devices themselves have not survived. And it appears in the texts describing the Abzu specifically as one of the things that can be found within the Abzu, the underground realm of fresh water beneath the Earth's surface, not gold lying in riverbeds waiting to be panned, gold associated with underground water. This is consistent with a real geological phenomenon. The presence of gold and other precious and semi-precious metals in hydrothermal systems, in the deposits formed by hot water moving through rock under pressure, carrying dissolved minerals that precipitate out as the water cools. These hydrothermal gold deposits are found globally. They are the source of a significant proportion of the world's gold supply, and they exist underground, in association with water, in exactly the geological context that the Sumerian texts describe. If the Anunnaki were mining gold from hydrothermal deposits in the Abzu, the underground water layer, then their operations would naturally center on locations where the Abzu is accessible from the surface. On locations where the underground geology makes the mineral deposits reachable. On locations marked, in other words, by exactly the same geological characteristics that the map text associates with the gate. Sitchin's reading of the Sumerian creation myth, the Enuma Elish, and the related tablets in the Atrahasis cycle is that the Anunnaki created human beings specifically to do the mining work that the lower-ranking Anunnaki, called the Igigi, were doing, and eventually refused to continue doing. The standard academic translation treats the relevant passages as describing agricultural labor, the hard work of digging irrigation canals and preparing fields, which the gods initially did themselves before creating humans to take over. Sitchin argues that the specific Sumerian words used in these passages are more naturally translated in terms of mining and processing operations, not agricultural ones, and that the context of the Abzu, the underground world associated with minerals and water, supports his interpretation. This is the part of Sitchin's work that academic Sumerologists most vigorously dispute. They argue that his translations are tendentious, that he is forcing the text to say what he wants it to say by choosing the secondary or tertiary meanings of words, rather than their primary meanings. That is a legitimate critique that deserves engagement. But it is worth noting that the standard academic translation, which renders the relevant creation passages as describing agricultural labor, also involves interpretive choices. The Sumerian word that is standardly translated as to till the soil or to cultivate the earth can also mean to dig or to excavate, depending on context. The choice of which translation is more accurate depends on the interpreter's prior model of what the text is about. If you go in expecting mythology about agriculture, you find mythology about agriculture. If you go in expecting something else, you might find something else. The text itself does not resolve the ambiguity. The ambiguity is real, and it is present in the primary source. The Igigi, the lower-ranking Anunnaki, who in Sitchin's reading were originally doing the mining work, have a complicated role in Sumerian literature. In some texts, they are celestial beings who maintain the movements of the heavens. In others, they are associated with the surface of the earth and its mineral wealth. In the Atrahasis myth, they are explicitly described as working in the ground, doing labor that exhausts them, that they eventually rebel against, leading to the creation of humankind. Their name has been translated as great gods, which is generic enough to be unhelpful, and also as those who watch and see, which is more interesting. The watching function, the same function attributed to the planetary watchers whose positions determine the operating schedule of the gate, the Igigi who watch and see, who work in the ground, who are eventually replaced by created humans, and who in later texts are associated with the boundary between the upper world and the underworld. In some texts, the Igigi are described as stationed at the gates, not the 7 gates of the descent, but gates of a different kind, gates that control passage between different levels of the cosmic structure. They are doorkeepers of a sort, managers of passages, and they have been doing this for a very long time, the texts suggest, a time period that the king lists. with their enormous reign durations measured in tens of thousands of years, gesture toward, without resolving, before the flood, before the current age of the world, in a time when the relationship between the upper world and the lower world was different from what it is now, when the gate was more open, when the passage was less guarded, when the boundary between the levels of reality was less fixed and more permeable. Something changed. The flood is described in the Sumerian texts not only as a natural disaster, but as a transformation of the cosmic structure, a tightening of the layers, a closing of passages that were previously more accessible. The world before the flood was different in character from the world after it, more connected to the levels above and below, more permeable to the beings and the forces that exist in those levels. The flood ended that period, and the gate since then has been more tightly sealed. This is a consistent motif across the mythological traditions of many cultures, and it is one of the details that the forbidden history research community finds most significant. The idea that there was a previous era of greater contact between different orders of reality, that something happened to reduce that contact, and that the traces of the previous era are preserved in architecture and text and oral tradition for anyone willing to look for them. The Greeks called the previous era the Golden Age, when gods walked among humans and the distance between human and divine was small. The Hindus called it the Satya Yuga, the age of truth and direct contact with the divine order. The Zoroastrians described it as the time before Ahriman, the Lord of Destruction, broke through the vault of heaven and introduced corruption into the created order, which is a remarkably specific description of a kind of interdimensional breach. The Norse tradition describes the time before Ragnarok, the age when the 9 worlds were in easier communication, when the world tree was healthy, and its roots reached without difficulty into all the realms it connected. All of these traditions describe the same basic structure, a time of greater openness, a catastrophe of some kind, a closing or sealing of passages, and a current era characterized by the reduced accessibility of the other levels. And all of these traditions preserve, in varying degrees of detail, the location and nature of the remaining access points. The places where the seal is thinner, the places where the gate still functions, even in its reduced capacity. The places on the surface of the earth where, at the right time, under the right conditions, the connection to the other levels can be re-established. The Sumerians just happen to have been the most systematic, the most bureaucratic, and the most literal-minded about it. They made a map. The map has a detail that is not often discussed because it is in a damaged section of the tablet, and the damaged portion has been reconstructed by scholars using parallel texts and contextual reasoning rather than direct reading. The reconstruction is marked as such in the scholarly editions. It is not presented as certain, but the reconstruction is considered by the scholars who produced it to be well supported by the context, and what it describes is a second gate, a gate that is different in nature from the 7 gates of the descent, not a gate that leads further into the underworld, but a gate that leads sideways. The Sumerian word used in the reconstruction is a compound that scholars have rendered as the passage to the parallel house, or the door to the house of the other direction. The parallel house, the place that is not the Kur, not the underworld of the dead, but something else, something adjacent to both the surface world and the underworld, but not identical to either. A third domain. This is not a concept that appears often in the mainstream discussions of Sumerian cosmology, where the standard model is a tripartite universe, heaven, earth, and underworld. But there are other Sumerian texts that gesture toward a more complex structure. There are references to a place called the Land of No Return that is distinguished from the Kur proper. There are references to something called the Apsidal Realm, the realm of the curvature, which the standard interpretation treats as another name for the underworld, but which the specific language of the relevant passages suggests is a distinct domain. And there is the concept of the Dulkug, the sacred mound, described in creation texts as the place from which the world was made, a primordial location at the intersection of all the cosmic levels, from which both the upper world and the lower world can be reached. The Dulkug is sometimes identified with the Abzu, It is sometimes identified with Eridu. It is sometimes described as a feature of the cosmic architecture that precedes and underlies both. And in the map text, if the reconstruction is correct, there is a gate that does not lead to the Kur, but leads to this third place, this curvature, this intersection of levels. A door not into the underworld, but into the infrastructure of the universe itself. Let us pause here and acknowledge something that is important for the intellectual honesty of this investigation. We are working with fragmentary evidence. We are working with ancient texts that have been translated and retranslated by scholars with differing assumptions and agendas. We are working with damaged tablets, partial excavation reports, academic silences that may reflect conspiracy, or may simply reflect the normal prioritization of research time and funding. We are working with a tradition of interpretation, the ancient astronaut and forbidden history framework, that has significant internal variety, that ranges from careful scholarship that happens to reach unconventional conclusions to wild speculation dressed up in academic vocabulary. Keeping all of that in mind, what is actually supportable? What can be said about the Sumerian map of the underworld and the gate it describes that does not require an unreasonable leap? Here is what is supportable. There exists a body of ancient Sumerian literature that describes the underworld in terms that are more concrete and geographic than purely metaphorical. The degree of geographic and architectural specificity in these texts is unusual compared to the mythological underworld traditions of other ancient cultures. There exists a tradition consistent across multiple Sumerian texts that the boundary between the surface world and the underworld is accessible at a specific physical location that has identifiable characteristics. The characteristics described in the map text are consistent with a real geological site type, a location with a subsurface cavity associated with underground water, producing infrasound and cold air outflow, located in the general area of southern Mesopotamia, near the oldest documented city on Earth. The archaeological record at that oldest documented city, Eridu, contains an anomaly, an underground cut-stone chamber of unknown depth beneath the most ancient layer of the Temple Mount, backfilled and not subsequently investigated. And there exists, scattered across multiple ancient Near Eastern traditions, a consistent description of a gateway phenomenon, a physically located threshold between reality levels, whose operating schedule is tied to astronomical cycles, whose approach is associated with specific sensory experiences, and whose improper use results in a specific kind of consciousness transformation that multiple traditions describe in nearly identical terms. What does not require a leap is the recognition that these pieces exist and that they are consistent with each other. What requires a leap is the specific interpretation of what they mean. And that is the leap that this investigation invites you to consider making thoughtfully with full awareness that you are making it. Now let us go into the text more deeply. Because the academic translations of the Descent of Inanna and the related underworld texts, the translations that appear in university anthologies and that are most often cited in secondary literature, are not the only translations available. They are the translations that reflect the choices of scholars working within the mainstream sumerological framework. And as we have discussed, those choices are not neutral. There is another translation tradition, less visible in academic venues, but developed by scholars with genuine Sumerian language training, that reads certain key passages differently. One of the passages where the translation divergence is most significant is the passage in the Descent of Inanna that describes what Inanna does at the first gate. In the standard academic translation, Inanna knocks on the door of the underworld and demands entry, and the gatekeeper Neti asks her why she has come, and she explains that she wishes to attend the funeral rites of her sister's husband. This is usually treated as the mythological pretext for the descent, the story logic reason why the goddess of the upper world would go to the underworld. In the alternative translation tradition, the passage is read differently. Inanna does not simply knock. She does something to the gate. The text uses a word that the standard translation renders as she cried out at the gate, as a loud vocalization. The alternative tradition renders it differently. The word in question has multiple possible meanings, and among them is something closer to she activated the gate or she set the gate in motion. The difference matters. In one reading, Inanna is a goddess arriving at a door and announcing herself. In the other, Inanna is a being who knows the operational mechanism of the gate and uses it. She does not ask permission. She does not wait for Neti to respond before the gate reacts to her. She does something, and the gate responds. The standard interpretation requires Neti to be the active agent, receiving the request and deciding whether to process it. The alternative interpretation makes Inanna the active agent, using knowledge of the gate's mechanism to initiate the descent process directly. And in the context of the map text, which describes the gate as a mechanism with specific operating conditions, the alternative translation is more internally consistent. The gate does not respond to personality, it does not respond to status, it responds to specific knowledge and specific conditions. Inanna has that knowledge. That is why she can descend. The question of what Inanna represents in the cosmological system is one of the most debated in Sumeriology. She is the goddess of love and war, which is an unusual combination that reflects the Sumerian recognition of the two as aspects of the same fundamental drive. She is associated with the planet Venus, the morning and evening star, the celestial body that regularly descends below the horizon, disappears from view, and rises again, a natural symbolic parallel for the descent into the underworld and return. She is the most complex personality in the Sumerian divine pantheon, described in texts as clever, aggressive, emotionally volatile, politically sophisticated, and capable of both extraordinary compassion and extraordinary cruelty. She is not a passive symbolic figure. She is an active agent who pursues her own goals within the cosmic structure, sometimes in conflict with the will of higher divine authority. And she is, according to the texts, one of a small number of beings who has physically entered the Kur and returned. Most beings who enter the Kur stay there. Inanna came back, and the story of how she came back is the story of the most complex negotiation in all of Sumerian literature, involving the exchange of a substitute, another being sent to the Kur in her place to hold her position there while she was released. The substitute was her husband, the shepherd king Dumuzi, and his own descent and eventual partial release, the mythological basis for the cycle of seasons, is the subject of a separate but related cycle of texts. What is significant for the gate question is this. The precedent of the descent and return establishes that the Kur can be exited, that it is not a permanent destination for everyone under all circumstances, that the gate works in both directions. And the map text, in its description of the gate's mechanism, includes a passage about the upward direction, about the conditions under which passage from the Kur to the surface is possible. The conditions are more restrictive than the conditions for descent. The gate is easier to enter than to exit, and the specific restrictions described in the text for the return passage are the restrictions that the map text author considered important enough to emphasize, presumably because they were the most frequently misunderstood or overlooked by people attempting the descent. Don't forget how to get back. Know the conditions, know the timing. The gate is not a trap, but it requires knowledge to navigate in either direction. And without that knowledge, it defaults to retaining whoever passes through it. In the year 2003, during the initial phase of the American-led invasion of Iraq, a series of events occurred in the southern part of the country that received almost no coverage in the international press at the time and have been almost entirely forgotten since. Several archaeological sites in the province of Dikar, the province that contains the ruins of Eridu, were briefly occupied by coalition military units in the rapid advance northward. The sites were subsequently secured and handed over to Iraqi cultural heritage authorities. But in the window between initial occupation and handover, some activity occurred at those sites that has never been formally documented. A number of archaeologists and cultural heritage workers who were in the region in the weeks following the initial combat operations have described, in private conversations and in a small number of print interviews, seeing evidence of digging at some of the sites that did not correspond to the looting pattern that affected sites elsewhere in Iraq, specifically sites in the Baghdad area and in the north near Mosul and Nineveh. Looting at those sites was extensive and chaotic, driven by local populations taking advantage of the security vacuum. The activity reported at certain sites in Diyaskar province was described as more targeted. Not random surface-level scavenging of easily portable artifacts, but deep digging at specific locations, with equipment that suggested advanced planning. At least one person who reported this described seeing a location near the mound of Eridu that showed evidence of a shaft having been sunk. A vertical excavation significantly deeper than looters would typically go, given the effort and the absence of surface-level artifacts to justify the expenditure of labor. The shaft, by the time this person saw it, had been refilled. But the displaced earth around it was fresh, and the volume of the displacement was substantial. This account has never been corroborated by a second witness. It has never been investigated formally. It exists as a single reported observation from an unreliable period of limited access and chaotic conditions. It may mean nothing. It is noted here because it is part of the record, however thin that part of the record is. Let us talk about the 7 gates in detail, because each of the 7 gates in the descent tradition is associated with specific attributes, and those attributes, when examined closely, form a coherent system that is not purely symbolic. The first gate, where Neti stands, is associated with the large crown of the traveler. In the context of the descent of Inanna, Inanna is wearing a specific crown as she approaches, and at the first gate it is removed. The standard interpretation is that the crown represents worldly status or authority, and the removal is the first stage of the stripping away of identity that the descent requires. But the crown described in the text is not a generic symbol of royalty. It has a specific name, the shigura, and the shigura is described elsewhere in Sumerian literature as a specific object with specific properties. An object that is placed on the head and that affects the wearer's perception of the upper realms, specifically their ability to perceive celestial events and to communicate with the divine beings of the upper world. It is described in one text as the helmet of the great mountain, where mountain is a common Sumerian metaphor for the divine realm. If the shigura is some kind of sensory or communicative technology, something that enhances connection to the upper levels of the cosmic structure, then removing it at the first gate is not symbolic of losing status. It is a practical preparation for operating in an environment where the physics of the upper realm no longer apply. You do not need the tool that connects you to the upper realm when you are in the lower realm. More precisely, the tool may interfere with function in the lower realm. The first gate strips the traveler of their connection to the level above. This is a technical operation, not a symbolic one, if the shigura is understood as something more than a piece of jewelry. The same logic applies to each of the 7 subsequent removals, each of which takes something that functions in the surface world and which would be non-functional or counterproductive in the level of the underworld associated with the next gate. By the 7th gate, the traveler has nothing. They are stripped of every tool and every symbol that connects them to the surface world. This is not humiliation. It is calibration. They are being made compatible with the environment they are entering. The second gate removes a rod and a ring. In the standard interpretation, these are symbols of power and divine authority. In the alternative reading, the rod and ring that Inanna carries are specific objects described elsewhere in Sumerian art and text. The rod and ring symbol is one of the most ubiquitous images in ancient Near Eastern iconography. It appears on cylinder seals, on stelae, on temple friezes, in texts ranging from the earliest periods to the latest. It is shown being presented by divine beings to kings, and it is associated in those contexts with the measurement and governance of the world. The rod appears to be a measuring instrument. The ring appears to be a unit of measurement or a standard of some kind. In modern terms, we would say they represent metrology, the science of measurement, the establishment of agreed-upon units by which the physical world can be quantified and governed. If Inanna carries these objects as part of her function as Queen of Heaven, their function is to maintain the order and measurability of the upper realm. Removing them at the second gate is removing the tools of upper realm order management from a traveler descending into a realm that operates according to different principles, where the metrology of the surface world does not apply. This reading is consistent with the function of the second gate in the map text, which describes it as the gate of measure, the place where the traveler's experience of scale and proportion changes. In the underworld, distances are different. Time is different. The subjective experience of space and duration does not correspond to the surface world norms that the rod and ring maintain. Removing them is preparation for a different relationship with space and time. If you have ever read accounts of experiences in deep meditation, in flotation tanks, in deep cave environments, or in documented near-death experiences, you have encountered accounts of a changed relationship with space and time that are strikingly consistent across cultures and individuals. The traveler in the Kur is described as experiencing exactly this. The map text is not simply describing mythology, it is describing phenomenology. The third gate takes the beads at the throat. Throat. Communication. The ability to speak in the mode of the surface world, to use language as it functions in the upper realm. The underworld in the Sumerian tradition is a place where language changes. The dead communicate in the Kur, but they communicate differently. There are texts describing the speech of the underworld as a speech of dust, a whisper, something barely perceptible to the surface world traveler who has not been fully prepared. The removal of the throat beads is the preparation for a different mode of communication. Not silence, but a different form of speech. At the fourth gate, the chest breastplate, the heart, the emotional body, the center of feeling and personal identity in Sumerian physiology. The underworld affects feeling differently. Emotions do not function in the Kur as they do on the surface. This is described in multiple texts as one of the most disorienting aspects of the underworld for living beings who encounter it. The quality of emotional experience is different there, not absent, but changed. The fifth gate takes the golden ring on the wrist. The wrist, the point of action, the place where intention becomes physical gesture. In the underworld, the traveler's ability to act in the physical mode of the surface world is reduced. They can intend. They cannot always manifest the intention in the physical mode they are accustomed to. The sixth gate removes the breastband across the chest. The breath. The breath in Sumerian physiology is intimately connected with the animating life force, the personal presence that distinguishes a living individual from a corpse. In the underworld, the life force of the descended traveler is present but changed in quality. They are still alive, technically, but their life force is operating differently, interfacing with an environment in which the normal physics of biological existence are not the governing reality. And the seventh gate removes the robe, the covering, the final layer of surface world identity. After 7 gates, the traveler is fully present in the underworld on its own terms, not disguised as a surface world being, not protected by surface world tools, fully exposed to the environment of the Kur, fully subject to its laws and its rulers, and fully capable, if properly prepared, of navigating it and returning. The being that the traveler meets at the bottom, Ereshkigal, is one of the most remarkable figures in all of ancient literature. Her name means Great Lady of the Earth, and she rules the underworld with absolute authority. She is not presented as evil. She is not presented as an adversary in the moral sense. She is presented as a sovereign who maintains the order of her domain, who enforces its laws with absolute consistency, and who is herself bound by those laws in ways that constrain even her. She cannot come up to the surface world. She is confined to the Kur exactly as the living are confined to the surface. The boundary works in both directions. And in the descent of Inanna, there is a moment that is one of the most psychologically interesting in the ancient literature, a moment where Ereshkigal is found by Inanna crying out in pain, in the pains of labor and of mourning. And Inanna, confronted with this spectacle, has a choice. She could take advantage of the moment to advance her position. Instead, the text describes her as responding with compassion. She mirrors the pain of Ereshkigal. She says exactly what Ereshkigal is saying. She reflects her sister's suffering back to her. And this act of compassionate mirroring is what begins the process of Inanna's release from the Kur. This is, depending on how you read it, either a psychological insight of remarkable sophistication, a narrative about the power of genuine empathy to transform even the most absolute constraint, or it is a description of a practical technique, a specific way of interacting with the sovereign of the underworld that the map text identifies as the protocol for the return passage. You do not negotiate with Ereshkigal. You do not bargain with her. You meet her in her pain. You share it. And that sharing creates the conditions under which the gate can open in the other direction. This is either profound mythological wisdom or it is instruction. The difference matters, and it is a difference that the ancient Sumerians would likely have found strange. For them, myth and instruction were not distinct categories. The stories of the gods were true, and the truth of the stories was practical. You could use them. That is why they were written down. The cuneiform writing system in which all of these texts are preserved is itself a remarkable thing to spend a moment with. It was developed by the Sumerians around 3400 BCE, initially as a system of accounting marks used to track goods in temple storehouses. It evolved within a few centuries into a system capable of representing the full complexity of the Sumerian language, including its grammatical nuances and its multiple registers of formality and technical vocabulary. It was pressed into clay using a reed stylus, leaving wedge-shaped impressions that give it the name cuneiform, from the Latin for wedge-shaped. Clay tablets survive remarkably well when baked, either deliberately or accidentally in fires, and a significant number of the Sumerian tablets that have survived to the present day survive because the buildings in which they were stored burned down, baking the tablets in the process. The irony of destructive fire as the mechanism of preservation is not lost on the scholars who work with these materials. The library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, where the sealed chamber was found by Layard, survived because Nineveh was burned to the ground by the Babylonians and Medes in 612 BCE. The fire that destroyed the city preserved the library, and in that library, along with the great literary works and the astronomical and mathematical texts and the medical texts and the administrative records, there were the sealed tablets. The tablets that were not meant to be part of the regular library, the tablets that were in a sealed room within the library, sealed again within a building that was itself one of the most protected structures in the ancient world. Why would you seal a room within an already secure archive? What was in there that required a second layer of security? The tablets that have been published from the Ashurbanipal library include, in their full sweep, some of the most important documents in human cultural history. The tablets that have not been fully published, the ones in the damaged section awaiting additional specialist review category, may include something more significant still. The British Museum knows what it has. What it chooses to publish and when is a decision made by human beings with professional interests and institutional constraints and their own frameworks of interpretation that determine what counts as important enough to prioritize. That is not a conspiracy. That is a sociology. And it means that the archive is not empty. It just has a queue. There is another location that the forbidden history researchers associate with the Sumerian underworld tradition, one that is geographically distant from Eridu, but texturally consistent with the map text description of a secondary access point. It is in what is now southern Turkey, in the region that was ancient Anatolia, in the highlands above the Harran Plain. The site is called Göbekli Tepe, and if you have been following alternative history research in the past 2 decades, you know it as the oldest temple complex in the world, predating Stonehenge by approximately 6,000 years, and the pyramids of Giza by approximately 7,000 years. It was built by people who, according to the mainstream chronological models, had no agriculture, no cities, no writing, and no organized religion. They were hunter-gatherers who somehow organized the labor required to carve and erect multi-ton stone pillars decorated with remarkably sophisticated animal imagery and geometric patterns, all at a location that would have required substantial food production to support the working population, which means they either had agriculture that has not been archaeologically detected, or they had some other means of sustaining a large organized workforce. The site was partially excavated by a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt, beginning in 1994 and continuing until his death in 2014. Schmidt's work revealed approximately 5% of the total site. The remaining 95% has not been excavated. Ground-penetrating radar surveys indicate that there are at least 20 and possibly more stone enclosures beneath the surface of the hill waiting. Schmidt described the site as a temple. His interpretation was that it was a cult site, a location where hunter-gatherer groups from across a wide region gathered for religious ceremonies. This is the standard academic interpretation. It is a reasonable interpretation. It is also an interpretation that leaves a great deal unexplained, including the sophistication of the carving, the astronomical alignments of the enclosures, and the specific decision to deliberately bury the entire complex under hundreds of thousands of tons of fill material sometime around 8000 BCE. Schmidt's interpretation of the burial was that it was a form of ritual decommissioning. The site was covered intentionally as part of some religious cycle. What it actually means to deliberately and systematically bury the oldest and most sophisticated religious complex in the world under thousands of tons of fill, and whether that burial was intended to preserve the site or to seal it, is a question that the ongoing excavations have not yet answered. What connects Göbekli Tepe to the Sumerian underworld tradition is a cluster of details that are individually explicable within the mainstream framework, but collectively uncomfortable. The first is geography. The site is in the highlands above the Harran Plain, and Harran is a city that appears in the Sumerian textual record as one of the important stopping points in the mythological geography of the ancient Near East. Harran appears in the book of Genesis as the city where Abraham stopped on his way from Ur to Canaan. Ur is the Sumerian city of the moon god Nana, one of the major urban centers of ancient Sumer in southern Iraq. Abraham's family, according to the Genesis narrative, came from Ur. They traveled to Harran, and Harran is within the general zone that the map text's second gate description places in the northwest direction from the primary gate location at Eridu. The second detail is the iconography. The stone pillars at Göbekli Tepe are carved with animals that have been extensively analyzed for their symbolic content. Many of the animals depicted are associated in later Mesopotamian religious tradition with the underworld and with the beings who inhabit it. Vultures, which in Sumerian iconography are consistently associated with death and the lower world. Scorpions, which guard the passage to the underworld in several ancient traditions, including the Sumerian, where a being called the Scorpion Man stands at the mountains at the edge of the world through which the sun descends. Snakes, which in Sumerian cosmology are associated with the underground and with the knowledge that resides there, the same knowledge that in the Genesis narrative the serpent in the garden offers to the first humans. The animal pantheon at Göbekli Tepe is not random. It is curated, and the curation is consistent with a specific iconographic program, one that emphasizes the boundary between the living and the dead, the passage between the surface world and the world below it. The third detail is structural. At least one of the excavated enclosures at Göbekli Tepe contains a feature that the excavators describe as a central pit. A hole in the bedrock floor of the enclosure, cut deliberately, descending to a depth that the published reports do not fully specify. Schmidt described the central pits as possibly associated with rituals of communication with the underground, meaning the dead. The pits at Göbekli Tepe are not anomalies. They are a consistent feature of the site's design, and they point downward. The question of what is actually below Göbekli Tepe has not been answered by the published literature. The hill on which the site is built is called Potbelly Hill in Turkish, Göbekli Tepe, and it is a natural limestone ridge that was modified by the site's builders. Limestone karst topography, which characterizes much of the region, is associated with extensive underground cave systems. Southern Turkey has some of the most extensive cave systems in the world, and they are not fully mapped. The depth and extent of the cave system that may underlie the Göbekli Tepe site has not been formally investigated. to the extent that any formal investigation of underground aspects of the site exists in the published literature. It may be that there is nothing of significance below the site beyond natural cave formations. It may be that there is something. The hill was chosen for the site. It was chosen by people who, whatever their technological and organizational level, clearly had sophisticated knowledge of landscape and cosmic alignment, given the astronomical relationships between the site's enclosures that have been documented in recent years. They did not choose this hill at random, and the tradition of building sacred sites at locations associated with specific underground characteristics, sites where the sound of the earth resonates differently, where the air from below has a particular quality, where the boundary between the levels of the cosmic structure is accessible, is a documented tradition across multiple ancient cultures. Göbekli Tepe was built first. The tradition that built it for a reason. And the reason, if it is consistent with the traditions that followed it, relates to the same set of questions that the Sumerian map text is answering. Where is the passage? Where is the gate? Where can the boundary between this level of reality and the one below it be experienced directly, physically, with the full sensory engagement of a living body? The answer, in the Sumerian tradition, has a specific address. In the tradition that built Göbekli Tepe, the address is where the hill is. The two traditions may be describing different locations. They may be describing the same understanding of the world, applied at different places along a network of locations that all share the same basic geophysical characteristics, all connected by the same geological logic, all functioning as nodes in a global network of access points to the deeper levels of reality. This is not a crazy idea. It is a specific and falsifiable hypothesis. It predicts specific things about the geophysical characteristics of ancient sacred sites globally. And those things can, in principle, be tested. Some of them have been tested in specific cases, and the results are consistent with the hypothesis. None of this is in the mainstream literature. All of it is in the footnotes and the field notes and the journals of the people who went to the unusual places and measured unusual things and wrote it up for journals that the mainstream does not cite. We need to talk about the Anunnaki and the Underworld in more detail, because the relationship between the upper Anunnaki and the Underworld is more complex and more interesting than the standard presentation of Sumerian religion suggests. The standard presentation is that the Anunnaki of the upper world were the good divine beings, the creators and sustainers of the surface world, and the beings of the underworld were a separate group, darker in character, associated with death and dissolution. This is an oversimplification that the Sumerian texts themselves do not support. The relationship between the upper and lower divine establishments is described in the text as one of negotiated coexistence, not opposition. The Anunnaki of the upper world and the Anunnaki of the lower world are described as members of the same family. They share ancestry. They share certain jurisdictions. They communicate through intermediaries. The division between upper and lower is a division of function, not of fundamental character. And the texts describe a period before the current cosmic arrangement was established when this division was less fixed, when the beings who now occupy the upper levels move more freely through the lower levels, and when the beings of the lower levels came more readily to the surface. The cosmic arrangement that currently obtains is described as the result of a series of decisions and events that occurred in the distant past, decisions made by the senior Anunnaki, the Council of the Great Gods, to establish the boundaries and jurisdictions that now exist. The gate is part of this arrangement. It is not a natural feature of the universe. It is a built feature, something that was constructed as part of the process of establishing the current cosmic order, which means the beings who built it knew how it worked. They designed it. They specified its operational parameters. And that knowledge, the knowledge of the gate's design and operation, is what the map text is attempting to preserve. Not for everyone, for the people who needed to know it, for the kings and the priests and the initiates who, in the Sumerian view, had specific responsibilities related to maintaining the relationship between the surface world and the levels above and below it. The map text was not written for the general population. It was written for the specialists. And the fact that it exists, the fact that someone considered it important enough to press into clay and preserve, means that the knowledge it contains was considered real and practical and necessary, not mythology, not poetry. Instruction. The concept of cosmic maintenance is one that does not have a comfortable home in the modern secular worldview, but it was central to the Sumerian understanding of why religious institutions and royal courts existed at all. The Sumerians believed that the world required ongoing maintenance to continue functioning, that the order of the cosmos was not self-sustaining, but needed to be actively maintained through specific actions performed by specific beings at specific times and places. The king performed rituals that maintained the connection between the surface world and the upper divine realm. The priesthood performed rituals that maintained the connection between the surface world and the lower divine realm. These were not optional. They were not symbolic. They were understood as technically necessary for the continued functioning of the cosmic order. If the rituals were not performed, the consequences were real and physical: crop failure, disease, flood, social chaos, the breakdown of the organizing principles that held the world together. This belief was not unique to the Sumerians. It is found in Egyptian religion, in the concept of Ma'at, the divine order that required continuous ritual maintenance, and that would dissolve without it. It is found in Vedic religion, in the concept of Rita, the cosmic order that the rituals of the Brahmin priesthood maintain. It is found in Mesoamerican religion, in the Aztec understanding of the sun as requiring sacrifice to continue rising each day. Across every major ancient religious tradition, the world requires maintenance. The rituals are the maintenance. The specialists who perform the rituals are the maintenance workers. And the knowledge of how to perform the rituals, including the knowledge of where the gate is and how to use it, is the engineering manual. The map text is a section of that manual. There's one more aspect of the map text that has been almost entirely absent from the discussions I have reviewed, both in the academic literature and in the forbidden history research. And I want to spend time on it because I think it is the most significant aspect of the entire document from the perspective of what it implies about the nature of reality as the Sumerians understood it. The map text, in its description of the gate and its operation, includes a passage about what happens to the world when the gate is open versus when it is closed. The text describes the gate in its closed state as the normal condition of the current era, the state in which the boundary between the surface and the lower levels is sealed and the two realms operate independently. The text describes the gate in its open state as producing what it calls an overflow, a word that in Sumerian has the specific connotation of water from a container rising above the container's rim, spilling over the boundary, moving from one vessel to the other. When the gate is open, something flows from the lower levels to the surface. The text does not say what that something is with complete clarity, but it uses a word that appears elsewhere in Sumerian literature in the context of divine presence, of the experience of being in proximity to a powerful divine being. The word is associated with a physical sensation, a heaviness, a pressure, a quality of atmosphere that is perceptibly different from normal conditions. When the gate is open, the surface world is flooded with this quality. It becomes perceptible to people who are not specifically trained for it. It affects everyone in the vicinity of the location. This is described in the text as both valuable and dangerous. Valuable because the presence of the divine quality from the lower levels is nourishing in some sense, is something that the surface world and its inhabitants need in measured doses. Dangerous because uncontrolled overflow is too much. The surface world is not designed to sustain the full intensity of what the lower levels contain. A controlled opening of the gate at the right time, managed by the right people with the right preparation, is medicine. An uncontrolled opening at the wrong time without management is catastrophe. And this is the reason for the gate's existence in the first place. Not to keep the lower levels away from the surface permanently, to regulate the contact, to allow it to occur at the right scale and the right frequency, to maintain the relationship between the levels without allowing either to overwhelm the other. This framework, the idea of a regulatory gate that manages the flow of energy or presence or whatever we call it between different levels of reality, is the framework within which the forbidden history research community's more interesting claims need to be evaluated. Not are the Anunnaki real. Not is there a literal physical cave at Eridu that leads to another dimension. But is there a principle of boundary maintenance between different levels of reality that the ancient world understood in practical terms and that we have forgotten entirely? Is the knowledge preserved in the map text a kind of engineering knowledge that has been lost not because it was wrong, but because the institutional context that maintained it, the temple complexes and the royal priesthoods and the initiatory traditions, was destroyed by the same historical forces that destroyed everything else about the ancient world? Empires fell, libraries burned, traditions were interrupted, the last person who knew a particular body of knowledge died without a student, and that body of knowledge, whatever it was, became inaccessible. Not permanently inaccessible. Inaccessible in the same way that a sealed room is inaccessible. The contents are still there, waiting for someone to open the door. The map text is a door. It is an incomplete door, damaged and partially translated and argued over by scholars who disagree about what it means. But it is a door, and it points towards something that was once known, once practiced, once considered so important that someone sealed it in a clay tablet and put it in a sealed room in the most protected library in the ancient world. Someone wanted this to survive. Someone wanted it to be found, eventually, when the conditions were right for it to be understood again. Whether those conditions are now is a question that only the people who are willing to go looking can answer. The archaeological site of which is not the same as Eridu, but is in the same general region, and was the cult center of the moon god Nana, contains a structure that has not received the popular attention of the famous ziggurat for which the site is known. Below the residential areas of the ancient city, the British archaeologist Leonard Woolley, who excavated the site in the 1920s and 1930s, found an extensive network of underground chambers and tunnels that he interpreted as the royal tomb complex of the early dynastic period. Some of these tombs are among the most spectacular ever discovered. The royal tombs of filled with extraordinary artifacts, including gold and lapis lazuli objects of remarkable craftsmanship, and the disturbing evidence of mass human sacrifice, dozens of courtiers buried alive with their monarchs. Woolley's interpretation of the tomb complex is widely accepted and is almost certainly correct in its broad outlines. These are tombs, but the extent of the underground network at is not fully published. Woolley's field notes, like those of the Eridu excavators, contain references to sections of the underground complex that were not fully explored. In one entry, he describes descending into a chamber that connected to a passage going downward at an angle he found uncomfortable for exploration without additional lighting and assistance. He did not go further. He noted it. He moved on. The field notes are at the Penn Museum, where they are accessible to researchers. The chamber Woolley descended into has not been re-excavated. The passage going downward at an angle has not been followed. In a site that the Sumerian tradition identifies as one of the holy cities of the Upper Anunnaki, a site where the moon god Nana maintained his earthly residence, there is an unexplored underground passage going into depths that have not been measured. That is a fact, just a fact. Draw your own conclusions. Now let us go back to the beginning, to the thing that makes all of this meaningful in a way that extends beyond the purely historical and the archaeological and the textual. The Sumerians, when they described the Kur, were not only describing a theological concept, they were describing an experience that had been accessed by specific people under specific conditions and reported back. The king lists of ancient Sumer describe 8 kings who reigned before the flood, with reign durations that modern historians find impossible to accept literally. The shortest reign listed is 18,600 years. The longest is 43,200 years. The total reign of the 8 pre-flood kings is 241,200 years. These are not human lifespans. Modern Sumeriology treats them as mythological figures, perhaps as dynasty names rather than individual reign durations, perhaps as astronomical periods expressed in the conventions of early number symbolism. The alternative reading, which goes back to at least the 19th century in Western scholarship, is that the pre-flood kings were not human, that they were the Anunnaki themselves, the divine beings who established the first cities and ruled them directly during the period before the flood, before the cosmic arrangement changed and the boundary between levels became fixed. If this is the case, if the early period of Sumerian civilization involved a much closer contact between the surface world and the beings of the levels above and below it, then the knowledge preserved in the map text is not speculative knowledge about a realm that had to be inferred from ritual and vision. It is direct knowledge. Knowledge derived from direct experience of the descent, reported by beings who were native to the cosmic architecture and could move through it with the same ease that a fish moves through water. The map text is accurate because it was written by someone who had been there, or by someone who had received an account from someone who had been there, someone for whom the underworld was not a mystery, but a destination, not a religious concept, but an address. And the map was written so that others could find it, so that the knowledge would not be lost when the beings who held it natively were no longer in the position to convey it directly, a manual for a world in which the direct teachers were no longer present. There is a tradition in certain currents of ancient Near Eastern scholarship that has been marginalized but never entirely suppressed, a tradition of taking the ancient texts at face value on the question of contact between different orders of being. The tradition holds that the religious and cosmological texts of the ancient world are not encoding metaphorical truths about human psychology and social organization, though they certainly do that too, but that they are preserving a record of a history of contact that was real and physical and that left traces in the world that can still be found if you know where to look. The traces include the architecture, the impossibly sophisticated early architecture that appears without a clear developmental precedent in multiple ancient cultures. They include the astronomical knowledge, the calculations that require observation periods longer than any single civilization's recorded history to produce, suggesting that the knowledge was accumulated over time periods that exceed the conventional chronologies. They include the texts themselves, with their specific technical vocabulary, their precise geographic descriptions, their operational detail, their insistence that the things they describe are real and can be verified by experience. And they include the sites, the physical locations on the surface of the Earth, that generation after generation of different cultures independently arriving at these places from different directions and with different cultural frameworks have identified as significant, as special, as locations where the normal rules do not quite apply, where the air is different, where the sound is different, where the experience of being present is different in a way that is difficult to articulate but impossible to dismiss once you have had it. The Sumerians had a name for that difference. They called it the quality of the Kur approaching the surface, the overflow of the lower realm reaching upward through the gate, the presence of Ereshkigal's domain pressing through the thin places of the world. Most of the people in recorded history who have encountered this quality have simply called it sacred. They built temples on the spots where they found it. They built the temples over the underground chambers and the passages and the pits that descend. And they maintained, across generations and centuries and millennia, the tradition of going to these places at the right time and under the right conditions and opening themselves to whatever flows upward from below. That tradition has not died. It has been driven underground, which is perhaps the appropriate metaphor. It exists in the initiatory traditions of various orders, in the practices of certain lineages of religious specialists, in the experiential reports of people who have gone to the thin places on their own and found them to be exactly what the old text said they were. The map is not lost. The gate is not sealed. The door is in the same place it has always been. The question is whether you are prepared for what you find when you open it. Let us revisit the evidence one more time with fresh eyes. We have a clay tablet or a group of clay tablets that contain what appears to be a geographic description of the entrance to the Sumerian underworld. The description uses landmarks that are physically specific and that correspond to real geographic features in the region of ancient Sumer. The location most consistent with the description is in the area of the oldest documented city in the world, Eridu, in what is now southern Iraq. Beneath the oldest structure at that city, archaeologists found an underground chamber that was not fully explored and was subsequently backfilled. The chamber was described in field notes as having walls of a harder stone than is locally available, suggesting it was not a natural cave, but a constructed space. The map text describes the entrance to the Underworld as a built structure with stone walls. The approach to the gate is described in terms of specific sensory experiences: infrasound, rising cold air, the smell of underground water, and altered visual perception. Each of these corresponds to real physical phenomena associated with certain types of geological sites. The operating schedule of the gate is described in astronomical terms consistent with the gravitational and tidal cycle influences that are known to affect geological activity. Multiple ancient traditions from cultures without documented contact with Sumer describe the same basic phenomenon: a physically located gateway to another level of reality, with remarkably consistent detail about its characteristics and its effects on consciousness. The site of Eridu is in a region that is currently inaccessible to systematic scientific investigation due to ongoing regional instability. The field notes documenting the underground chamber are in an archive that was significantly damaged in 2003. The academic literature on the map text is partial and contested, and the alternative research tradition that has taken the map text most seriously has been marginalized from mainstream discourse for reasons that are partly legitimate, the weaknesses of specific claims, and partly institutional, the discomfort that the implications create for conventional models of history and reality. None of this proves anything. It demonstrates that the question has not been answered, that the investigation has not been completed, that the file is open, and that the people who would tell you the question has already been settled and the answer is myth are either wrong or not telling you everything they know. The final thing to say about the sealed Sumerian map of the underworld is this: the concept of the underworld in ancient cosmology is not primarily a description of death. It is primarily a description of depth. What is below? What is at the deeper levels of reality? What exists beneath the surface experience of everyday consciousness and the physical world it moves through? Every major ancient tradition that developed a sophisticated cosmology asked this question and answered it with some version of the same structure. There are levels below this one. Those levels are accessible under certain conditions, and what you find there is more fundamental to the nature of reality than what you find on the surface. The Sumerians asked the question and answered it with a map, a literal geographic operational map that tells you where to go, what to expect when you get there, and how to come back. This is an extraordinary document. Whether it describes a literal underground realm ruled by literal divine beings who were once physically present in the ancient world, or whether it describes the deep structure of consciousness and the physical world in geographic metaphor, or whether it describes both simultaneously in a way that our categorical distinction between metaphor and literal description does not fully capture, it is a document that takes the question of depth seriously. More seriously than most modern institutions are comfortable with. And it invites you to take the question seriously too. Not to accept any particular answer uncritically. Not to believe the map because it is old, or because it was sealed, or because the people who do not want you to find it have been suspiciously persistent about not wanting you to find it. But to consider seriously the possibility that the oldest civilization in the recorded world knew something about the structure of reality that we do not, and that they left directions. Let us go further. Because we have been building toward a question that has not yet been asked directly, a question that sits at the center of what makes the map text genuinely significant rather than merely interesting. The question is this: why is the map sealed? Not just the room in the library of Ashurbanipal, not just the physical clay. Why is the knowledge sealed? Why in every tradition that preserves it is the knowledge of the underworld's location and the gate's operation treated as restricted, as dangerous, as appropriate only for initiates who have undergone specific preparation? If the map is simply a religious text, a mythological description of the afterlife realm, there is no obvious reason to restrict it. Myths are shared. Stories are told. The cosmological framework of Sumerian religion was not secret. The general population knew that the Kur existed, knew that the dead went there, knew the names of its rulers and the broad outlines of its geography. What was secret was the operational detail, the specific location, the specific conditions, the specific protocols, the sections of the map that tell you how to actually go there rather than simply what it is. Why seal that? The answer that the forbidden history tradition gives is the one that follows most directly from the text itself. The gate is real. The passage is real. An unprepared passage through it produces results that are destructive to the individual and potentially destabilizing to the surface world. The seal on the knowledge is protective, not protective of power, not a monopoly maintained by priesthoods for their own benefit, though that too may be part of the historical sociology. Protective in the same way that you do not publish the operational specifications of a potentially dangerous system without the accompanying safety procedures and training requirements. The map is sealed because the thing it maps is dangerous. Not metaphorically dangerous, actually dangerous. Dangerous to individuals who approach it without preparation, and dangerous, according to the text, to the stability of the surface world if the gate is operated carelessly or at the wrong time. This raises a question about the current moment. We are in a period of extraordinary excavation, both literal and metaphorical. More ancient sites are being investigated than at any previous period. Ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging and LiDAR surveys are revealing structures beneath and around sites that were previously considered fully understood. Texts that were partially translated in the 19th century are being re-examined with improved tools and new linguistic resources. The field of archaeoacoustics is systematically documenting the acoustic properties of ancient sites and finding consistent patterns that suggest deliberate design for specific acoustic effects. The underground cave systems and cavities associated with ancient sacred sites are beginning to be investigated with more sophisticated geophysical tools. All of these investigations are producing findings that do not fit neatly within the conventional models. And simultaneously, the digital revolution has made the alternative research tradition, the body of work that the mainstream has marginalized, more accessible to more people than at any previous point in history. The sealed knowledge is being unsealed not by initiates performing controlled rituals, but by millions of people with smartphones watching videos about Sumerian maps of the underworld at 2 in the morning. This is not what the people who sealed the room in the library of Ashurbanipal anticipated. Their model of controlled access assumed a world in which knowledge flowed through institutional channels that could be managed. The internet is not a managed channel. It is an uncontrolled opening. And the question the map text would ask, if it could speak, is whether the people accessing the knowledge through this uncontrolled opening are prepared for it. Whether the millions of curious individuals who are encountering for the first time the idea that the oldest civilization in the world left a map to a real location where the boundary between levels of reality is physically accessible, whether those people have the preparation that the map text describes as necessary for the knowledge to be useful rather than dangerous. The map text does not answer that question for you. It tells you what the preparation consists of. And the preparation is not magic. It is not ritual in the sense of meaningless ceremony. It is psychological. It is intellectual. It is the cultivation of a specific quality of awareness that allows you to encounter the unfamiliar without either dismissing it or being overwhelmed by it. The capacity to hold a genuinely open question, to sit with uncertainty without either forcing a resolution or collapsing into confusion, to be curious rather than afraid. These are the qualities that every initiation tradition, in every culture that has maintained one, has tried to cultivate in its members before allowing them access to the deeper levels of its knowledge. They are not esoteric qualities. They are simply the qualities that allow genuine investigation to occur, as opposed to the performance of investigation that merely confirms what the investigator already believes. Whether you are a mainstream archaeologist defending the conventional model or an alternative researcher defending the ancient astronaut framework, the map text's requirement of preparation applies equally. Neither camp, in the current state of the investigation, is in a position to claim that they have the full picture. The gate is still sealed in the practical sense. The archive is still incomplete. The chamber is still backfilled. The passage in Woolley's field notes is still unexplored. The 95% of Göbekli Tepe that has not been excavated is still underground. The investigation is not finished. It has barely begun. Here is what we can say with confidence. We can say that the ancient Sumerians, the oldest documented civilization, had a detailed and specific understanding of a cosmological structure that included a physically located access point to what they understood as a lower level of reality. We can say that the description of this access point is specific enough to correspond to a real geographic location. We can say that the archaeological record at that location contains anomalies that have not been satisfactorily explained within the conventional model. We can say that the knowledge of this access point was considered important enough to preserve in a sealed archive, suggesting that the people who preserved it believed it was practically significant rather than merely symbolically interesting. We can say that multiple ancient traditions independently describe the same type of phenomenon with consistent structural details. We can say that modern geophysics identifies real physical phenomena associated with specific types of underground sites that correspond to the sensory descriptions in the map text. And we can say that the full investigation of the relevant evidence has not been conducted, that the access point has not been formally located or tested, and that the institutional barriers to conducting that investigation are real and significant, but not absolute. What we cannot say with confidence is what the investigation would find if it were conducted fully and honestly, and without the weight of prior assumptions determining the interpretation of results. We cannot say because it has not been done. And that ultimately is the most important thing to say about the sealed Sumerian map of the underworld. Not what it contains, not what it implies, but the fact that the question it poses remains genuinely open, that the investigation remains genuinely incomplete, that the file is genuinely still active, and that the people who have convinced you that the case is closed are the people who have not read the file. In the myths of ancient Sumer, there is a plant. It is called different things in different texts: the plant of life, the plant of heartbeat, the food of the gods. It appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the great Sumerian poem that has been called the first work of literature in human history, a poem that is also, on close reading, a story about the search for immortality and the encounter with the underworld. Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, loses his closest companion Enkidu to death, and in his grief, he becomes terrified of his own death and embarks on a quest to find the secret of eternal life. His journey takes him through the underworld, through the land of darkness, to the shore of the waters of death, where he finds the one mortal human who was granted immortality by the gods, a man named Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood, the Sumerian Noah. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh about the plant at the bottom of the sea, the plant that will restore youth to whoever consumes it. Gilgamesh dives into the water. He finds the plant. It tears his hands as he grasps it. He brings it up. He begins his journey back, and then stopping to rest and wash in a pool of water, he falls asleep. And a serpent, smelling the fragrance of the plant, comes up from the water and takes it. The serpent sheds its skin as it retreats into the water, a detail the ancient audience would have understood. The serpent keeps the secret of renewal for itself. Gilgamesh wakes up. He sees the snake tracks in the sand. He sits down and weeps. He does not find the plant again. He returns to Uruk. He looks at the walls of his city. He measures them. He engraves the story on a tablet of lapis lazuli. He seals it. He buries it in the foundations of the wall, and the poem ends. The great king of Uruk, who found the gateway and walked through it and reached the plant of immortality, lost it to a serpent in a pool while he slept. He came home empty-handed. He wrote it down. He sealed it. He buried it in the place where his city would stand as long as his city stood, so that someone would eventually find it. and read it and know that he had been there and understand that the question is real, even if the answer is harder to hold than it appears, even if the serpent of distraction and inattention takes it from you at the last moment. The map exists, the gate is real, and the plant, whatever it is still at the bottom of somewhere, waiting for someone who will not fall asleep before they get home. Gilgamesh's story is the story of every civilization that has approached the gate and not quite made it through with the knowledge intact. The Sumerians made it closer than most. They made the map. They identified the location. They specified the conditions. They described the experience. They wrote it on clay that would last for millennia. And then their cities were abandoned, their libraries buried under rubble and desert sand, their language forgotten for 2,000 years, until a series of European scholars in the 19th century sat down with the wedge-shaped marks in the clay and began, slowly and imperfectly, and with constant argument about what the marks actually meant, to read. We are the inheritors of that reading. We are the people who arrived at the library after it burned down and found the tablets that the fire baked into permanence. We are reading the sealed text. We are looking at the map, and the map is showing us something that is not easy to look at squarely: the possibility that the world is larger and stranger and more layered than the models we have been given to describe it. That the depth we feel when we stand in old places, the sense that there is more here than is visible, is not an artifact of overactive imagination, but a perception of something real. That the ancient traditions of every culture on Earth preserved knowledge of this depth because the depth is actually there and they had been in it. And that the key to reaching it again is not a secret ritual or a forbidden text or an initiatory mystery, but simply the willingness to take the question seriously, to look at the map, to go to where the map points, and to be prepared for what you find when you get there. There is a contemporary angle to this investigation that deserves serious consideration, and it is one that the mainstream archaeology community and the alternative history research community have both, in different ways, failed to adequately address. The angle is consciousness, specifically the growing body of research in cognitive science, quantum physics, and the emerging interdisciplinary field, sometimes called consciousness studies, that points toward a model of mind and reality in which the Sumerian cosmological framework is not as absurd as the standard materialist model would suggest. The standard materialist model of mind says that consciousness is a product of brain activity, that there is nothing above or below the physical universe in any meaningful sense, and that the ancient descriptions of other realms are simply the projections of a brain that has evolved to look for patterns and meaning, and therefore finds them everywhere, including in places where they are not objectively present. This model has served as the background assumption of modern science for approximately 2 centuries, and it is a productive model within certain domains. It is very good at building technology. It is very good at explaining the mechanisms of physical processes. It is not very good at explaining consciousness itself. The so-called hard problem of consciousness, the question of why there is subjective experience at all, why the physical processes of the brain produce the felt quality of experience rather than simply processing information in the dark, remains genuinely unsolved within the materialist framework. Philosophers of mind have debated it for decades without resolution. And as the debate has continued, certain anomalous findings have accumulated at the edges of the materialist model. Findings about near-death experiences that include verified information about events that occurred while the experiencer's brain was clinically inactive. Findings about shared consciousness experiences between separated individuals in controlled experimental settings. Findings about the anomalous effects of conscious observation on quantum systems. Findings about the statistical significance of remote viewing and precognition in the database of properly controlled parapsychology research. None of these findings is individually conclusive. Collectively, they constitute a pressure on the materialist model that the model is not well equipped to absorb. And the direction in which they push, taken seriously, is toward a model of mind and reality in which consciousness is not confined to individual brains. in which the structure of reality includes information or awareness at levels that are not accessible to normal surface world perception, and in which specific physical locations or conditions can affect the permeability of the boundary between ordinary and extraordinary modes of consciousness. In other words, toward a model that the Sumerians would recognize. The physicist David Bohm proposed in the 1970s and 1980s a model of reality that he called the implicate and explicate order. The explicate order is the world as we normally perceive it. Separate objects, linear time, clear causal chains. The implicate order is the underlying structure from which the explicate order unfolds, a level of reality in which the separations that characterize the explicate order do not obtain, in which everything is in connection with everything else, in which the apparent independence of objects and events is a surface phenomenon overlying a deeper unity. Bohm derived this model from his interpretation of quantum mechanics, specifically from the phenomena of non-locality and entanglement, which demonstrate that particles that have interacted remain connected in a way that does not diminish with distance, and that violates the assumption that separated objects are causally independent. He was careful not to make metaphysical claims beyond what the physics required, but the structure he described, a hidden layer of reality beneath the accessible surface layer, in which the separations of the surface layer dissolve, and which can be accessed under certain conditions, is structurally identical to the Sumerian description of the Abzu and the Kur. Bohm's implicate order is not the underworld, but it occupies the same architectural position in his model of reality that the underworld occupies in the Sumerian model, beneath the ordinary, more fundamental, accessible, under specific conditions, and constituting the deeper nature of what the surface world is. The Sumerians did not have the language of quantum physics. They had the language of their cosmological system. If they were genuinely describing something that corresponds to what Bohm later described from first principles of physics, then the map text is not mythology in the dismissive sense. It is a document in a different language about the same reality. And the gate is not a religious symbol. It is a description of the conditions under which the surface layer of reality becomes transparent to the deeper layer, the conditions under which the implicate order becomes perceptible. The conditions that produce the experiences that initiates in every tradition have described as the most real, the most true, the most fundamentally important experiences of their lives. We have come a long way from the clay tablet, but the clay tablet is still there in the museum with its cuneiform marks pressed into it by a hand that moved 4,000 years ago in a city that no longer exists, in a civilization that the world forgot for 2 millennia before a group of European scholars sat down to read the wedge-shaped marks in the clay and give the world back to itself. The map is partial, the translation is contested, the location is inaccessible. The investigation is incomplete. The mainstream is not looking in the right direction. The alternative research tradition is looking in something closer to the right direction, but is burdened by its association with claims that go beyond the evidence. And somewhere in the desert of southern Iraq, beneath decades of fill and centuries of neglect and millennia of accumulated rubble, there is a cut-stone chamber of unknown depth descending into the ground beneath the oldest city in the world, at the site where the Sumerians said the Lord of the underground waters built the house of the Abzu over the place where the surface of the earth meets the deeper levels of what exists. The chamber is there. It has been found and backfilled once. It will be found again. And when it is found again by people who are prepared to take seriously the question of what they are looking at, and who have the intellectual and institutional courage to follow the evidence to wherever it leads, something will change. Not everything. Not all at once, but something. The map will become less sealed. The gate will become less theoretical. And the investigation that the oldest civilization in the world considered important enough to press into clay and seal in a stone room in a burning library, preserving it across 4,000 years of history's most chaotic century. Following century will take a step forward, because the people who sealed the map wanted it to be found. They wanted someone eventually to have the question they had, and to follow it, and to go to where it leads. That is what they made the map for. That is what it has been waiting for. And that is what this investigation, in its own incomplete and imperfect way, is the beginning of. For the kings who ruled before the flood, for the 8 who are listed in the king lists with their impossible reign lengths, for the beings who administered the world in the period when the gate was more open and the levels were less sealed, the underworld was not a mystery. It was a destination. It was a place they went, and the world they returned from was the world they had left. The surface world, the world of cities and fields and rivers and the movements of stars overhead and the smell of rain on hot ground, and the specific weight of clay in the hand. When you press a reed into it and make marks that will last, they made marks. 4,000 years of marks. In the British Museum, in the Iraq Museum when it was whole, in the archives of every institution that has received tablets from the excavations of the past 2 centuries, there are marks in clay that have not been fully read, questions that have not been fully answered, maps that have not been fully followed. The gate is in the clay. The gate is in the map. The gate is in the question. And the question, as it has always been, is whether you are willing to go further than you were told you could. Everything the Sumerians wrote about the underworld converges on one point. The Kur is not a punishment and it is not a reward. It is the deeper level of the same reality that the surface world is the upper level of. The dead who go there do not go somewhere else. They go further into the structure of what reality is, and the living who have prepared themselves, who know the map, who have assembled the necessary preparation, can follow them part of the way and return. They can go in far enough to understand something about the deeper structure that cannot be understood from the surface. And they come back changed in the way that the map text describes, not by losing something permanently, but by having encountered something that reorients everything else. The fear of death, which the Eleusinian initiates described as being dissolved by the ritual descent and return at Eleusis, is the surface-level consequence. Underneath it, what changes is the relationship to the surface world itself. When you have been, however, partially to the deeper level, the surface level looks different. Not lesser, not an illusion to be dismissed, but understood in its proper context as the upper layer of something larger, something that extends in all directions, something that the surface only partially reveals. The map is an invitation to that understanding, not by reading about it, not by watching a video about it, but by going to wherever your own investigation leads you and taking seriously what you find there and being willing to revise your model of what the world is based on what the evidence actually shows rather than what you have been told to expect. That is what the Sumerians did. That is what the map is for. And that is what this conversation has been trying to say from the beginning. The clay tablet is still there. The map is still on it. The gate is still where the map says it is. The investigation continues, and the question, as it has always been, remains genuinely open. If this kind of investigation is what you come here for, you are in the right place. There is a subscribe button. There is a notification bell. There is a comment section where thousands of people who take these questions seriously are having exactly the conversation that the mainstream says cannot be had. Drop a comment and tell me what you think the map text is actually describing. Tell me what part of this investigation landed hardest for you. Tell me what you would ask if you had access to the field notes that are still in the archive, to the chamber that is still backfilled, to the passage in the ancient city that no one has followed to its end. The investigation that began with a clay tablet 4,000 years ago is still going. You are part of it now. Go deeper. There are 3 specific tablets in the British Museum collection that Sumeriology scholars have flagged over the past 40 years as containing material that does not fit the standard categories. They are not the tablets from the sealed room, or at least they are not identified as such in the current catalog, which was reorganized multiple times after Laird's original excavations, and which does not reliably track the original find contexts of every piece. These 3 tablets are cataloged under different acquisition numbers in different series and were translated at different times by different scholars. But when the relevant translated passages are set beside each other, a pattern emerges that is difficult to account for within the standard interpretive framework. The first tablet contains a passage describing the construction of a sealed chamber beneath a temple. The description is architectural: specific dimensions, specific materials, specific orientation with respect to the directions of the compass. The orientation is unusual. The chamber is described as positioned so that its descent axis aligns with a specific astronomical direction, a direction that corresponds, when calculated against the ancient Near Eastern celestial sphere, to the point in the sky where a specific cluster of stars is found at a specific time of year. The second tablet contains a passage describing the activation of a mechanism. The language is technical, using vocabulary from the Sumerian engineering tradition, words that appear elsewhere in descriptions of irrigation systems and of the water-lifting devices used in ancient Mesopotamian agriculture. But the context here is not agricultural. The mechanism being described is below ground. It is associated with the movement of something from below to above, from a lower level to a higher one. The third tablet contains a passage describing what happens in the vicinity of a specific location at a specific time. The passage describes environmental effects, unusual sounds, changes in the quality of light, the behavior of animals in the area, and the experiences of people who approach closely. The description of the human experiences is consistent with the map text's account of the approach to the gate. The three passages, from three different tablets in three different catalog series, describe what appears to be the construction, activation, and operation of a mechanism at a specific underground site that produces measurable environmental effects and specific effects on human consciousness. Scholars who have noticed the connection between these three passages have not published on it. The connection is visible if you are reading widely in the primary sources. It is not visible if you are reading only the secondary literature, which does not discuss these passages in relation to each other because the scholars who produced the secondary literature were specialists in their own series of tablets and were not looking for cross-series connections that suggested impossible things. The connection is there, it is in the primary sources, and it is waiting for someone to take it seriously. The last word belongs to the gate itself, not to the scholars who have translated the text, not to the researchers who have argued about its implications, not to the institutions that have controlled access to the evidence, and not to this investigation, which is imperfect and incomplete and full of the same biases and blind spots that affect every investigation conducted by a human mind in a specific cultural moment. The last word belongs to the gate, because the gate, according to the map text, has its own logic and its own timing and its own conditions of opening, and those conditions are not subject to human argument or institutional decision-making, or the preferences of television networks or the algorithms of video platforms. The gate opens when it opens, under the conditions the text describes, at the time the astronomical configuration requires, and when it opens, the overflow the text describes moves from the lower level to the upper level, regardless of whether anyone is positioned to perceive it or prepared to understand what they are perceiving. The world has been receiving that overflow intermittently for as long as the gate has existed. The strange places, the thin spots, the locations where the quality of experience is different in the way that is felt rather than explained. They are felt by everyone who goes to them with sufficient attention, regardless of their belief system, regardless of their cultural context, regardless of whether they have read the map text or the Descent of Inanna or anything else. The phenomenon is independent of the interpretation. The map is the attempt to interpret it, and the interpretation has been partial and contested and sealed and partially lost and partially recovered and is still in progress. But the phenomenon itself has not been sealed. It has not been lost. It is still there, in the places where it has always been, doing what it has always done, pressing upward, asking to be recognized, waiting for the investigation to catch up with the reality it is investigating. The gate was sealed for the era of sealed things. The era of sealed things may be ending. And what comes next may look less like the mythology the mainstream dismissed, and more like the map the Sumerians drew, which was always less a document about the past and more a set of directions for the future. For the people, in whatever future moment, who would be ready to follow them? You are in that moment now. The map is in your hands. The gate is where it has always been. And the question of whether you go further is yours alone to answer. There is a final thread in this investigation that loops back to where we began, to the clay tablet itself, to the act of pressing a reed into wet clay and leaving marks that were intended to survive the person who made them. We do not know the name of the scribe who wrote the map text. We do not know whether they were a high priest or a royal official, or a scholar in a temple scriptorium, or a keeper of specialized knowledge whose role has no modern equivalent. We know that they had access to information that was not widely available, that they considered it important enough to record with care, and that the recording was preserved with a level of security that distinguishes it from the ordinary archival material of the time. We know that they wrote in a register of the Sumerian language that indicates formal and technical intent, not the informal language of personal correspondence, or the elevated language of poetry, but the precise functional language of documentation. They were not telling a story. They were recording a fact about the world as it actually is as they understood it, a fact that they believed was worth preserving for someone they would never meet, in a future they could not have imagined, at a time when the conditions for using the knowledge would again obtain. Whether that time is now, whether the conditions have been met, whether the people reading the map in this moment have what the preparation requires is not a question the scribe could have answered. They could only make the record as accurate and durable as possible and leave the rest to whatever forces govern the movement of knowledge through time. They pressed the reed into the clay. They let it dry. Someone sealed it in a room. The city burned. The tablet survived. And here we are, 4,000 years later, with the marks still legible, still pointing toward the same location, still describing the same gate, still waiting for the investigation to be completed. The scribe did their part, the clay did its part, the fire, unintentionally, did its part. The scholars who excavated and translated, imperfectly and partially, did their part. And now the question passes to you, not as a metaphor, as the actual continuation of an actual investigation. That began in the oldest city in the world. That was recorded on clay. That was sealed in a burning library. That survived. That is still open. And that ends, if it ends, not with a conclusion, but with a doorway. The investigation is not finished. It was never meant to be finished by any single person or any single document or any single era. It is the kind of investigation that passes from generation to generation, accumulating evidence and losing evidence and recovering it again, never quite arriving at a final answer, because the thing it is investigating is too large and too deep and too fundamental to the nature of reality to be fully captured in any single framework. But it moves, incrementally, imperfectly, with wrong turns and dead ends and occasional moments of genuine illumination. That is what investigation is. The map was made for the investigation, and the investigation continues.